The thing about driving alone at 3 a.m. is that your mind starts playing tricks on you. But what happened on Interstate 40 through New Mexico wasn't a trick. I wish it had been. I was driving from Phoenix to Denver, a route I'd taken dozens of times during college breaks, when I noticed something odd about the mile markers. At first, I thought I was just tired from the 10-hour drive, but the numbers weren't making sense. Instead of counting up as they should on an eastbound interstate, they were counting down. Mile 127, mile 126, mile 125. I figured maybe there was construction or some weird state numbering system I'd never noticed before. So I kept driving, my Honda's headlights cutting through the desert darkness. The radio had been playing classic rock for hours, but around mile 115, the signal started getting fuzzy. Static crept in between songs, and occasionally I'd catch fragments of what sounded like old-time radio shows. The kind my grandfather used to listen to with dramatic announcers and sound effects that seemed too crisp for the weak signal. The strange thing was, these weren't reruns. The news they were reporting was current, but delivered in that 1940s broadcasting style. Traffic accidents, missing persons, severe weather warnings, all happening right now. But narrated like Walter Cronkite was still alive. By mile 100, I was wide awake and completely focused on those countdown markers. Every single one was perfectly visible in my headlights, which was weird because usually you can barely see mile markers at night, unless you're specifically looking for them. These seemed to glow with their own pale light. The radio static was getting worse, but the vintage news broadcasts were getting clearer. A smooth-voiced announcer was describing a multi-car pileup on Interstate 40 in New Mexico, giving details so specific, the exact mile marker, the number of casualties, even the license plate numbers, that I started getting genuinely spooked. Around mile 85, I realized I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, not one. On a major interstate that usually has at least some traffic, even in the middle of the night, the complete absence of other vehicles felt wrong. The road stretched endlessly ahead, perfectly straight across the desert. And behind me, my taillights reflected off nothing but empty asphalt. The radio announcer was now describing the victims of the accident in detail, their names, ages, where they were traveling from and to. One of them was a college student driving alone from Phoenix to Denver. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel when I heard my own name, mile 75. The announcer's voice was crystal clear now, describing how the accident happened. A driver fell asleep at the wheel, drifted into oncoming traffic, and caused a chain reaction involving 7 vehicles. The timestamp he gave was exactly 4 hours from now, mile 60. The radio was playing what sounded like my own voice, confused and scared, asking someone for help. But I wasn't saying anything. My lips weren't moving, yet somehow my voice was coming through the speakers, describing the exact road I was on, the exact mile markers I was passing. Mile 50. I tried changing the radio station, but every frequency played the same broadcast. I turned the radio off completely, but the voices continued, now seeming to come from inside the car itself. The announcer was interviewing other drivers involved in the accident, and I recognized every voice. My parents, my girlfriend, my roommate, people who weren't even supposed to be on this road, all describing their final moments before the crash. Mile 25. That's when I saw the other headlights. They appeared suddenly in my rearview mirror, maybe a quarter-mile back, moving fast. Way too fast for the safe following distance. As they got closer, I could see it was a semi-truck, its headlights blazing like 2 suns in my mirror. The radio announcer's voice was urgent now, describing how the truck driver had been awake for 22 straight hours, how he'd been popping caffeine pills and fighting microsleep episodes for the last 100 miles. Mile 15. The truck was gaining on me, and I pressed the accelerator harder than I ever had. My Honda's engine screamed as I pushed it past 90, then 95, then 100 mph. But the truck kept getting closer. In the radio, I could hear the truck driver's voice, slurred with exhaustion, talking to his dispatcher about making good time. About pushing through to Denver without stopping for his mandatory rest break. Mile 10. I could see the truck's grill in my rearview mirror now, chrome and steel reflecting my taillights. The radio was broadcasting live commentary of what was happening right now, describing my car's acceleration, the truck's pursuit, the inevitable collision that would occur at mile marker 1. Mile 5. That's when I understood. This wasn't a prediction or some supernatural warning. This was a countdown to something that had already happened, was happening, would always be happening on this stretch of road. The mile markers weren't marking distance. They were marking time remaining before the loop reset. Mile 3. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right and shot off the interstate onto a dirt access road, my car fishtailing in the loose gravel. Behind me, the truck's horn blared as it thundered past on the interstate, its massive bulk shaking my car even from the shoulder. Mile 1. I sat there in the desert darkness, engine ticking as it cooled, watching the truck's taillights disappear around a curve. The radio had gone completely silent, not even static, just dead air. In the distance, I could see the glow of mile marker 1, but something was different about it. As I watched, the number flickered and changed to 127. I waited there until sunrise before getting back on the road, and I drove straight through to Denver without stopping. When I looked up the accident reports later, I found them. 7 vehicles, multiple fatalities, exact location at mile marker 1 on Interstate 40. But the accident had happened 3 years ago. Every year since, on the same night, at the same time. I take I-25 through Colorado now when I drive home. It's longer, but some roads aren't worth the time you save. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving alone, I still hear that radio announcer's voice describing accidents that haven't happened yet. Reading names of people who don't know they're already dead. The thing about time is that it's not as linear as we think, especially on certain stretches of highway where tragedy has worn a groove deep enough for the universe to skip like a broken record. The mile markers are still counting down for someone else now. And that announcer is still broadcasting to an audience of 1, somewhere in the desert darkness between Phoenix and Denver. The Eisenhower Rest Area on I-70 in Kansas looks like every other highway rest stop in America, complete with vending machines and picnic tables. What makes it different is that some of the people sitting at those tables have been there for a very long time. My family was driving from Denver to Kansas City for my daughter's college orientation when we pulled in around 11 p.m. It had been a long day of driving, and my wife Sarah needed to stretch her legs, while our twins, both 16, complained about the lack of cell service. The rest area was well lit with those harsh fluorescent lights that make everything look sickly. And there were maybe a dozen cars scattered throughout the parking lot. Nothing unusual there. But as we walked toward the building, I noticed something that made me pause. There were people sitting at the concrete picnic tables outside, even though it was nearly midnight and the temperature had dropped into the 50s. An elderly man in a plaid shirt sat perfectly still at one table, his hands folded in front of him, staring straight ahead. A woman in a 1980s-style purple windbreaker occupied another table, also motionless, also staring. At a third table, a family of 4, parents and 2 young children, sat in complete silence. Their positions so rigid, they looked like mannequins. Sarah nudged me and whispered that it was weird to see people just sitting outside so late. But the kids were already heading toward the restrooms. and I figured maybe these folks were taking a break from driving, same as us. Truck drivers and long-distance travelers keep odd hours. But as we passed the first table, I got a closer look at the elderly man's face. His eyes were open, but there was something wrong with them. They were too dry, like he hadn't blinked in hours. When I looked closer, I realized I couldn't see him breathing. Inside the rest area building, everything seemed normal. Clean restrooms, working sinks, vending machines humming quietly. But through the large windows facing the picnic area, I could see all those people still sitting in exactly the same positions. The woman in purple hadn't moved a muscle. The family of 4 remained frozen in their weird tableau. My son Jake came out of the restroom first and immediately went to one of the windows. "Dad, how long do you think those people have been sitting out there?" he asked. I swear that old guy was in the exact same position when we drove up 20 minutes ago. That's when I started paying closer attention. Sarah and my daughter Emma emerged from the women's room, and we all stood at the window watching the people outside. Not one of them had shifted position even slightly. The father of the family outside was wearing a Chicago Bears jersey that looked like it was from the early 1990s, faded and stretched in a way that only comes from decades of wear. The mother's hair was styled in a way I hadn't seen since I was a kid, but it was their children that really bothered me. The little boy and girl, maybe 8 and 10 years old, sat with their backs perfectly straight, hands folded on the table, staring into the darkness with the same unblinking intensity as the adults. "Maybe they're waiting for someone," Sarah suggested, but her voice carried uncertainty. We stood there for another 10 minutes, and literally nothing changed. No movement, no conversation, no indication that these were living people taking a rest break. Jake, being a teenager with more curiosity than sense, decided he was going to go outside and ask if they were okay. Before I could stop him, he pushed through the double doors and approached the elderly man's table. Through the window, we watched Jake speak to the man, but the man didn't respond. Jake waved his hand in front of the man's face, and still nothing. No acknowledgement, no reaction. Not even a blink. That's when Jake started backing away from the table, and I could see the fear on his face, even from inside the building. He practically ran back to the doors, and when he came inside, he was pale and shaking. "Dad, something's really wrong with those people," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I touched the old man's hand, and it was cold. Like, really cold. And his skin felt weird, kind of waxy. But the worst part was his eyes. When I looked close, I could see my reflection in them. But it was like looking into glass. There was nothing behind them. Emma wanted to see for herself, but I wasn't letting either of my kids go back outside. Instead, I walked over to the information board near the entrance to see if there were any notices about the rest area, any explanation for what we were seeing. What I found made my blood run cold. There was a memorial plaque I hadn't noticed when we first came in, mounted between the tourist brochures and highway maps. The plaque commemorated a family of 4, the Hendersons, who had died in a car accident at this exact rest area in 1994. Parents Michael and Janet, children Timothy and Lisa. According to the plaque, they had stopped here during a family vacation when a drunk driver plowed through the picnic area, killing all 4 instantly. Below their names were photographs, and I recognized them immediately. They were the family sitting outside at table 3. My hands were shaking as I read the other names on the memorial. Harold Gustafson, 1987. Dorothy Kellerman, 1991. Each name corresponded to someone we had seen outside, people who had died at this rest area over the past several decades. But the memorial plaque was weathered and old, which meant these deaths had happened years ago. The people sitting outside should have been long buried. Sarah came over to see what I was looking at, and when she read the plaque, she grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "We need to leave. Right now," she whispered. But when we looked out the window again, something had changed. The people at the tables had all turned to face the building. They were staring directly at us through the glass, their heads angled at unnatural positions, their dead eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights. And there were more of them now. Every picnic table was occupied by perfectly still figures in clothing from different decades. A man in a 1970s leisure suit. A woman in a 1960s shift dress. Teenagers in 1980s punk rock attire. All of them sitting in that same rigid posture, all of them staring at our family with those glassy, lifeless eyes. The worst part was that I started recognizing some of the vehicles in the parking lot. Cars that had looked normal when we arrived were now clearly from different time periods. A wood-paneled station wagon from the 1970s. A boxy sedan that screamed 1980s. A pickup truck with styling I remembered from my childhood in the 1990s. These weren't modern cars parked by living travelers. They were the vehicles these people had died in. Somehow still here. Still waiting. Emma pointed toward the back corner of the parking area, where a newer sedan sat with its hazard lights blinking. "That car wasn't there when we came in," she said. "And look, there's someone walking toward the tables." A man in modern clothes was approaching one of the empty tables, moving with the slow, purposeful gait of someone extremely tired. As we watched in horror, he sat down at the table, placed his hands in front of him in that same folded position, and became perfectly still. Within seconds, his natural posture shifted to match the others, unnaturally straight, unnaturally rigid. "The car," Sarah said urgently. "We have to get to the car right now." We moved as a group toward the exit, but as soon as we opened the doors, every head at every table turned to track our movement. The silence outside was absolute. No night sounds, no wind, no traffic from the interstate. Just the soft hum of the fluorescent lights and the terrible weight of all those dead eyes watching us. We walked quickly toward our SUV, trying not to look directly at any of the figures at the tables. But I could feel them watching our every step. When we reached our car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that will haunt me forever. The newest arrival, the man who had just sat down, had turned his head to watch us leave. But unlike the others, he was mouthing words. I couldn't hear him through the closed windows and over the engine noise, but I could read his lips clearly. "Don't leave me here. Please don't leave me here." We drove straight through to Kansas City without stopping, even when the kids needed restrooms and Sarah wanted coffee. I reported what we had seen to the state police, but when they called the rest area maintenance department, everything was normal. No reports of people loitering, no complaints from other travelers. But I've done my research since then. The Eisenhower rest area has the highest number of single-vehicle accidents and unexplained deaths of any rest stop on I-70. People pull in for a quick break and are found hours later sitting at the picnic tables, dead from apparent heart attacks or strokes, always with that same peaceful expression and perfect posture. The state keeps installing more lights and security cameras, but they never capture what really happens there after midnight. They only record the moment when tired travelers become permanent residents of the Eisenhower rest area, joining the others who wait at those concrete tables for something that never comes. I take I-35 through Missouri now when we drive to Kansas City. It's a longer route, but some rest stops don't offer the kind of rest you can wake up from. Sometimes the kindest gestures come from the cruelest intentions, and the most dangerous predators are the ones who offer help with a smile. I learned this lesson on Highway 19 through rural Georgia, where my car troubles attracted exactly the wrong kind of Good Samaritan. I was driving from Atlanta to Savannah for my younger sister's wedding when my 2018 Honda Civic started making a grinding noise just outside of Dublin, Georgia. It was one of those small towns where the main drag consists of a Dollar General, a gas station, and maybe 3 local businesses struggling to stay afloat. The grinding got worse until my car finally died completely about 2 miles past the town limits on a stretch of road bordered by pine trees and not much else. No cell service, naturally. Just me, a dead car, and the growing realization that I was going to miss the rehearsal dinner if I didn't get help soon. That's when Harold showed up. He was probably in his 70s, driving a pristine 1990s Ford pickup that looked like it had just rolled off the lot. White hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the sort of gentle demeanor that reminded me of my grandfather. He pulled over without me even flagging him down and walked over with a concerned expression that seemed completely genuine. "Car trouble, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice carrying that soft southern drawl that makes you want to trust someone immediately. When I explained my situation, he nodded sympathetically and offered to give me a lift to the nearest garage. "There's a good mechanic about 15 minutes back toward Dublin," he said. "Fellow named Bobby runs an honest shop. I'll take you there, and then we can figure out about getting your car towed." Everything about Harold seemed legitimate. His truck was clean but lived in. With a thermos of coffee on the dashboard and a well-worn Bible on the passenger seat, he talked about his late wife, his grandchildren in Macon, his 40 years working for the railroad before retirement. He knew every back road in the area and pointed out local landmarks as we drove. The old Baptist church where his wife had been buried, the farm where he'd grown up, the creek where he used to fish as a boy. The mechanic's shop was exactly where Harold said it would be. And Bobby turned out to be a real person who knew Harold by name and seemed genuinely concerned about my situation. But here's where things started feeling off. Bobby said he could fix my car, no problem, but he'd need to order a part that wouldn't arrive until the next morning. Harold immediately offered to let me stay at his place for the night, insisting it was no trouble, and that his late wife would have done the same for any stranded traveler. I should have called my sister, should have insisted on a motel, should have trusted the little voice in my head that was starting to whisper warnings. But Harold seemed so harmless, so genuinely helpful, and I was stressed about the wedding and grateful for his kindness. His house was a modest ranch-style home about 10 minutes outside of town, surrounded by pecan trees and a well-maintained garden that spoke to someone who took pride in his property. That evening, Harold cooked dinner and showed me photo albums of his family. Everything seemed normal, even pleasant, until I excused myself to use the bathroom and noticed something that made my skin crawl. In the hallway leading to the guest room were framed photographs of young women, all roughly my age, all smiling at the camera in what looked like candid shots. But these weren't family photos. These women were strangers, and judging by their clothing and hairstyles, the pictures had been taken over the span of several decades. When I returned to the living room, I tried to act normal while studying Harold more carefully. He was still the same kindly old man, still talking about his grandchildren and asking about my family. But now I noticed things I had missed before. His hands were unusually strong for someone his age, with calluses that suggested regular physical work. There were slight inconsistencies in his stories about his late wife. Her name changed from Margaret to Martha between conversations. and the year of her death shifted from 2015 to 2018. I excused myself early, claiming exhaustion from the day's stress, and locked myself in the guest room. That's when I found the journal hidden in the nightstand drawer. It was filled with entries written in Harold's careful handwriting, dating back over 20 years. The entries were disturbingly detailed accounts of young women he had helped over the years. Car troubles, flat tires, running out of gas. Harold had been strategically positioning himself to assist stranded female travelers for decades. The journal described how he would follow potential targets for days or even weeks, learning their routines and travel patterns. He would sabotage their vehicles in subtle ways, loosening battery connections, puncturing tires with slow leaks, adding substances to gas tanks that would cause engine failure at predictable intervals. Then he would appear at just the right moment, the helpful Good Samaritan ready to rescue them from their predicament. But the rescue was always temporary. The journal detailed what happened to these women after they accepted his help. And I realized, with growing horror, that I was following the exact same pattern as his previous victims. The mechanic in town was part of it, always finding reasons why repairs would take longer than expected, keeping victims dependent on Harold's generosity until it was too late to escape. The most recent entry was dated just 3 days ago and described a young woman named Jennifer who had been driving from Florida to North Carolina. Harold had caused her alternator to fail near the same spot where my car had broken down. The entry ended with a chilling note about how Jennifer had joined his collection and would be visiting soon. I realized with sickening clarity that Harold had been following me long before my car broke down. The mechanical failure wasn't random, it was orchestrated. He had been tracking my route probably for days, waiting for the perfect opportunity to play the helpful stranger. Moving as quietly as possible, I gathered my things and tried the bedroom window. It opened easily, and I slipped out into the night, leaving my purse and phone behind to avoid making noise. Harold's property backed up to dense woods, and I made my way through the trees, using the distant glow of the highway to navigate. Every sound made me freeze in terror. Was that footsteps behind me, or just wind in the leaves? It took me nearly 2 hours to reach the highway, and when I finally flagged down a passing truck driver, I was scratched, exhausted, and borderline hysterical. The driver, a middle-aged woman named Carol, immediately called 911 and stayed with me until the police arrived. The investigation revealed that Harold Brennan had been operating his scheme for over 30 years. They found evidence linking him to the disappearances of at least 18 young women, all of whom had experienced mysterious car troubles in the same area. The mechanic, Bobby, had been filing false repair reports and insurance claims as part of the operation. But the most disturbing discovery was in Harold's basement. He had converted it into a series of small rooms, each decorated with personal items from his victims: clothes, jewelry, photographs, driver's licenses. He had been keeping these women prisoner, some for months, before eventually killing them and burying them on his property. The authorities found my car exactly where I had left it. But when they had it towed to a legitimate garage, the mechanic discovered that someone had loosened the alternator belt and added sand to the oil. My breakdown had been completely deliberate. Harold was arrested and eventually convicted, but he never revealed the locations of all his victims' remains. During his interrogation, he maintained that he had only been trying to help, that he was a good Samaritan who cared about the safety of young women traveling alone. He seemed genuinely confused by the accusations, as if his decades of predatory behavior were acts of Christian kindness. I testified at his trial, and the experience was almost as traumatic as the original encounter. Harold sat quietly in the defendant's chair, looking like everyone's harmless grandfather, occasionally dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. Even knowing what he had done, part of me still wanted to believe he was just a lonely old man who had made some mistakes. But I've learned to trust my instincts now, especially when someone's help seems too convenient or too perfectly timed. Real good Samaritans don't follow you for days, don't sabotage your car, and don't have photo albums full of strangers in their hallways. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who present themselves as your saviors, and the kindest faces hide the cruelest intentions. I drive a different route to Savannah now, and I always make sure someone knows exactly where I am and when I'm expected to arrive, because predators like Harold are still out there, still offering help to stranded travelers, still waiting for the next victim to trust their grandfatherly smile and accept their deadly generosity. When you've been driving the same route for 15 years, you stop noticing the landmarks. But you definitely notice when they start repeating themselves in ways that shouldn't be possible. What happened to me on Route 15 through Pennsylvania's Endless Mountains region defied every law of physics I thought I understood. And I'm still not sure I escaped. I've been a long-haul trucker for most of my adult life, running freight from Pittsburgh to New York City at least twice a week. Route 15 through the mountains has always been one of my favorite drives. Scenic, well-maintained, with truck stops positioned at reasonable intervals. I know every mile of that road like the back of my hand, every curve and gradient, every exit sign and overpass. So when I started seeing the same McDonald's billboard for the fourth time in what should have been a straight 200-mile stretch, I knew something was seriously wrong. It was a Tuesday night in late October, around 10 p.m., when I first noticed the repetition. I was hauling automotive parts in my Peterbilt, making good time despite a light drizzle that had been falling since Harrisburg. The first time I saw the McDonald's billboard, the one advertising their seasonal pumpkin spice shakes, I didn't think much of it. Corporate America loves to plaster the same ads every few miles. But when I saw it again exactly 23 minutes later, in what should have been a completely different section of highway, I started paying closer attention to my surroundings. The second repetition included more than just the billboard. I recognized a specific rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, a distinctive red barn with a collapsing roof, and a bridge over a small creek that had a unique stone arch design. These weren't common features that might appear multiple times along a route. These were specific, memorable landmarks that should only exist in one location. By the third repetition, I was checking my GPS constantly, but it insisted I was making normal progress northbound on Route 15. According to the satellite data, I had traveled over 150 miles since leaving Harrisburg, but I kept seeing the same sequence of landmarks in the exact same order. The McDonald's billboard, the sleeping giant rock formation, the red barn, the stone arch bridge, then a stretch of forest, a small town with a single traffic light, and a Sunoco gas station with a faded sign advertising diesel at prices from 3 years ago. What made it even more unsettling was the timing. Each complete loop, from the McDonald's billboard back to the McDonald's billboard, took exactly 23 minutes at my current speed of 65 mph. That should have covered about 25 miles of highway, but I was somehow covering the same 25 miles over and over again without ever turning around or changing direction. The fourth time I saw that McDonald's billboard, I decided to stop at the Sunoco station to figure out what was happening. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. Maybe the repetitive nature of night driving was playing tricks on my mind. But when I pulled into the gas station, everything felt wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. The attendant was a young guy, maybe early 20s, with the kind of vacant stare you get from working the night shift at a truck stop for too long. When I asked him about the location and how far I was from the next major city, he gave me answers that didn't match what my GPS was showing. According to him, I was still 200 miles from New York City, despite having been driving for hours. That's when I noticed the other trucks in the parking area. There was a red Kenworth that looked familiar, and when I walked closer, I could see the company logo on the door, Mullins Transport out of Ohio. I had seen that exact truck with that exact license plate number about 2 hours ago when I passed it on a hill climb. But that had been at least 100 miles back, and there was no way the Kenworth could have beaten me to this location. Inside the truck stop, I found the driver of the Kenworth sitting at a corner table, staring at a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold hours ago. When I approached him, he looked up with eyes that held the same confused exhaustion I was feeling. "How long have you been here?" I asked him. "I don't know," he replied, his voice flat and distant. I stopped for fuel, and I'm not sure when that was. "What time is it now?" I told him it was almost midnight, but he insisted he had stopped just after 8 p.m. The problem was, I had seen his truck on the highway at 9:30, which meant either he was lying or something impossible was happening with time itself. We compared notes and discovered we had both been experiencing the same phenomenon. The repeating landmarks, the GPS readings that didn't match the terrain, the feeling that we were covering distance without actually getting anywhere. He had tried calling his dispatcher, but his cell phone couldn't get a signal despite showing full bars. The truly disturbing part was when we realized we weren't alone. There were 6 other drivers in the truck stop, all with similar stories of being caught in some kind of temporal loop on Route 15. Some claimed they had been stopping at this same truck stop for days, unable to continue their routes because every time they left, they ended up right back where they started. One driver, an older woman named Ruth, who hauled refrigerated goods, said she had been trapped for what felt like weeks. She had tried everything, taking different exits, turning around and going the opposite direction, even abandoning her truck and trying to walk out of the area. But every attempt to escape the loop brought her right back to the same stretch of highway with the same sequence of landmarks. "It's like the road won't let us leave," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had exhausted every logical explanation. "We're feeding it somehow, keeping it alive with our movement. Every time we drive that loop, we're giving it energy." I wanted to dismiss what she was saying as the ramblings of someone who had been alone on the road too long. But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. When I checked the fuel gauge on my truck, it showed I had used almost a full tank of diesel despite traveling the same 25 miles repeatedly. The odometer had advanced over 300 miles, and my logbook showed continuous driving time even though I had only covered the same section of road. The mechanic who worked at the truck stop, an older man who seemed more aware than the others, pulled me aside and explained what he believed was happening. According to him, certain stretches of highway could become charged with psychic energy from the thousands of drivers who traveled them daily. Most of the time, this energy was harmless. But occasionally, especially during certain weather conditions or times of year, it could create what he called temporal eddies. "Think of it like a whirlpool," he said, "but instead of water, it's time and space getting twisted up. Drivers get caught in the current, and the only way out is to stop feeding energy into the system. You have to break the pattern." His solution sounded insane, but at that point, I was willing to try anything. He told me to drive the loop one more time, but instead of maintaining steady speed and following the road like a normal driver, I needed to vary my speed dramatically, take the next exit regardless of where it led, and refuse to fall into the hypnotic rhythm that the road was using to trap me. The next loop was the most terrifying drive of my career. As I approached each familiar landmark, I could feel the road trying to pull me into the same steady rhythm, the same comfortable cruise control speed that had trapped me in the first place. But I fought it, speeding up and slowing down randomly, taking my foot off the accelerator at unexpected moments, even pulling over and stopping for 30 seconds at arbitrary locations. When I reached the McDonald's billboard for what I hoped would be the last time, I took the next exit without even looking at the sign. It led to a small rural road that I had never seen before, winding through farmland and forest until it eventually connected with Interstate 80. My GPS suddenly started working normally again, showing my actual location and providing realistic directions to my destination. I completed my delivery to New York City 12 hours behind schedule, but I was so grateful to have escaped that I didn't care about the late penalty fees. When I reported what had happened to my dispatcher, he said 3 other drivers had called in with similar experiences on Route 15 over the past month. All of them had been trapped in the same loop, and all of them had eventually escaped by breaking the rhythmic pattern that the road seemed to require. I still run freight to New York City, but I take Interstate 80 now, even though it adds an extra hour to my drive. Because some roads demand more from you than just fuel and time. They want your attention, your consciousness, your willingness to surrender to their hypnotic pull. And once they have you in their grip, they don't let go easily. The highway hypnosis that truckers joke about isn't always just fatigue. Sometimes it's the road itself, hungry for drivers who will feed its endless loop with their movement and their minds. The rearview mirror in my Honda showed one hitchhiker when I picked him up outside Flagstaff, Arizona. But by the time I reached the California border, there were 5 people crammed into my back seat. I never stopped to let anyone else in. I've always been the type of person who picks up hitchhikers, much to my family's horror and constant warnings about serial killers and kidnappings. But I figure everyone deserves a helping hand, and I've met some fascinating people over the years who are just down on their luck and trying to get somewhere important. So when I saw a young man with a backpack and a cardboard sign reading Los Angeles standing at the on-ramp to Interstate 40 west of Flagstaff, I didn't hesitate to pull over. His name was Marcus, and he looked like a typical college kid, maybe 22 or 23, wearing a faded Grateful Dead t-shirt and jeans that had seen better days. He was polite, grateful for the ride, and had a reasonable story about missing his bus connection and needing to get back to UCLA for an important exam. We talked easily as we drove through the high desert of northern Arizona, discussing music, college experiences, and the beautiful landscape rolling past my windows. About an hour into the drive, somewhere near Winslow, I glanced in my rearview mirror to check traffic and noticed something that made me do a double take. There was a second person sitting in my back seat next to Marcus, a middle-aged woman in what looked like a 1980s business suit, her hair styled in that distinctive big shoulder pad era way. She sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, and when I looked directly at her through the mirror, she seemed almost translucent. I figured my eyes were playing tricks on me. The late afternoon sun was creating weird shadows through the rear window, and I'd been driving for several hours already. When I mentioned to Marcus that I thought I saw someone else in the back seat, he turned around and looked, and then shrugged and said he didn't see anyone. The woman was still visible to me in the mirror, but when I turned around to look directly, there was nothing there but empty seat. By the time we reached Holbrook, there were 3 people in my back seat. The woman in the business suit was still there, now joined by an elderly man in overalls and a flannel shirt who looked like he belonged on a farm sometime in the 1950s. Both of them sat motionless, staring forward with expressions of quiet desperation. Marcus continued to insist he couldn't see them. And when I described what I was seeing, he suggested I might be getting tired and offered to drive for a while. But I wasn't tired. If anything, I was becoming more alert, more focused on the growing impossibility of what was happening in my car. The back seat was designed for 3 people at most. But somehow these additional passengers were fitting without crowding Marcus at all. They seemed to exist in the same space without interfering with each other, like overlapping photographs. Near Winslow, a 4th passenger appeared. This one was a teenage girl in what looked like 1970s clothing, bell-bottom jeans and a peasant blouse, her long hair parted in the middle. She was crying, though no sound came from her. And she kept looking toward the front of the car with an expression of profound sadness. That's when I started to understand what might be happening. I pulled over at a rest area and asked Marcus about the history of Interstate 40. He seemed genuinely puzzled by my questions about accidents and fatalities along this stretch of highway. But when I pressed him for details about his own situation, where exactly he was coming from, why he had missed his bus, how long he had been waiting at that on-ramp, his answers became vague and inconsistent. "How long were you standing there before I picked you up?" I asked him directly. "Not long," he replied, but his voice had a distant quality, as if he was remembering something from a long time ago. "I've been trying to get home for, well, it feels like forever." That's when I realized Marcus might not be any more alive than the other passengers I was seeing in my rearview mirror. I got back on the highway with a growing sense of dread, checking my mirror constantly as more passengers continued to appear. By Flagstaff, which we should have already passed, there were 5 people in my back seat, all from different time periods, all staring forward with that same expression of desperate hope. The elderly man in overalls was the first to speak, though his voice seemed to come from very far away. "I've been waiting so long for someone to see me," he said, his words barely audible over the road noise. "I just want to go home. I just want someone to take me home." The woman in the business suit turned to look at me in the mirror, and when she spoke, her voice was clearer. "I was driving to Los Angeles for a job interview in 1987. She said. "My car broke down right here, and I started walking. I remember being so cold, and then nothing. Just waiting by the road, hoping someone would stop." One by one, they told me their stories. The teenage girl had been hitchhiking to San Francisco in 1974 when she accepted a ride from the wrong person. The elderly man had suffered a heart attack while changing a flat tire in 1963. Each of them had died along this stretch of Interstate 40. And somehow, they had all been drawn to my car because I was one of the few drivers who could actually see them. Marcus was the most recent addition to this group of lost souls. He had been hitchhiking toward Los Angeles just 2 weeks ago when he was struck by a drunk driver who didn't stop. He had been standing at that on-ramp ever since, hoping someone would pick him up and take him home. "But you did see me," he said, turning in the passenger seat to look at me directly. "You stopped for me. That has to mean something." The strangest part was that despite the supernatural nature of what was happening, I felt compelled to help them. These weren't malevolent spirits trying to harm me. They were lost people who had died tragically and were stuck in a kind of limbo, relying on the kindness of strangers to find their way to whatever came next. As we approached the California border, something began to change. The passengers in my back seat started becoming more solid, more present. I could hear them breathing, could see them more clearly without relying on the rear-view mirror. They began talking to each other, sharing stories about their lives and their deaths, finding comfort in the fact that they weren't alone in their strange situation. When we reached Barstow, the elderly man suddenly smiled. the first time I had seen any emotion other than sadness on his face. "I can see the light," he said softly. "There's a light ahead." And then he was gone, simply fading away like mist in sunlight. One by one, as we continued toward Los Angeles, the other passengers found their peace and disappeared. The teenage girl vanished near Victorville with a whispered, "Thank you." The businesswoman faded away as we approached the San Bernardino Mountains, finally able to let go of her desperate need to reach that long-ago job interview. Marcus lasted the longest, staying with me until we reached the outskirts of Los Angeles. As we drove through the pre-dawn darkness, he told me about his family, his dreams, his regrets about the choices that had led him to that fatal hitchhiking trip. "I don't think I'm supposed to go back to UCLA," he said as we approached downtown. "I think I'm supposed to go somewhere else now." When the sun came up over the City of Angels, casting the first golden light through my windshield, Marcus looked at me one final time. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "Thank you for not being afraid." And then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of desert sage and the memory of his grateful smile. I drove the rest of the way into Los Angeles alone, but I didn't feel alone. I felt like I had been part of something important, something that had helped 5 lost souls find their way home. The experience changed how I think about the road, about the people we meet along the way, and about the thin line between the living and the dead. I still pick up hitchhikers, but now I pay closer attention to who gets in my car and whether they cast shadows in the sunlight. Because sometimes the people who need rides aren't trying to get somewhere in this world. They're trying to get somewhere else entirely. And they need someone who can see them to help them make that final journey. The desert highways of the Southwest are full of lost souls. And sometimes, if you're paying attention and your heart is open, you might be the one chosen to help them find their way home. The Conoco station on Route 321 in rural North Carolina sits at the intersection of nowhere and forgotten, where fresh flowers appear around the gas pumps every morning, despite no florist for 50 miles. What I discovered about those flowers during my 3 a.m. fuel stop changed everything I thought I knew about grief, death, and the places where tragedy leaves permanent scars. I was driving from Asheville to Charlotte after visiting my sick grandmother in the mountains when I had to stop for gas around 3 a.m. Route 321 winds through some of the most isolated parts of western North Carolina, where cell phone towers are scarce and towns are separated by miles of dense forest. The Conoco station appeared like an oasis in the darkness, its bright fluorescent lights cutting through the fog that had been following me down from the mountains. The first thing I noticed as I pulled up to the pumps were the flowers. Not just a few scattered bouquets, but dozens of fresh arrangements placed carefully around each gas pump island. Roses, lilies, carnations, baby's breath, all arranged in the kind of elaborate displays you'd see at a funeral home. Some had small cards attached, others had photographs tucked between the stems, and a few had what looked like personal items scattered nearby. A child's toy car, a woman's scarf, a man's wallet. The station attendant was a thin, weathered man in his 60s, who watched me through the bulletproof glass with eyes that had seen too much. When I went inside to pay, I asked him about the flowers, expecting some explanation about a recent accident or memorial service. What he told me made me wish I had never stopped. "Those aren't for one accident," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had been telling the same story for years. "This stretch of road has claimed more lives than any other in western North Carolina. Been that way since they built the highway back in the 1960s. Something about the curve just before the station, the way the fog settles in the valley, the grade of the hill. Cars lose control right there almost every month." He gestured toward the window, where I could see the curve he was talking about. Even in the darkness, it looked treacherous. A sharp left turn that came up suddenly after a long, straight stretch where drivers might be tempted to speed. The kind of curve that would be invisible until you were already committed to it. Especially in fog or rain. The flowers started appearing about 10 years ago, he continued. At first, it was just families of the victims, coming by to leave memorials where their loved ones died. But then other people started coming. People who said they felt drawn to this place, like they needed to leave something for the dead. What he said next made my skin crawl. The thing is, some of the people leaving flowers, they ain't family members. They're the victims themselves. I must have looked skeptical because he immediately pulled out a thick photo album from behind the counter. I started documenting this after I realized what was happening, he said, flipping through pages of photographs taken at the gas station over the years. Look at these pictures and tell me if you see anything unusual. The first few pages showed normal-looking people placing flowers around the gas pumps. Grief-stricken families, young people who might have been friends of victims, elderly couples who could have been grandparents. But as I continued looking through the album, I started noticing something disturbing. Some of the same faces appeared in multiple photographs taken years apart, but they never aged. A young woman in a red dress appeared in photos from 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021, always placing the same arrangement of white roses at pump number 3. A teenage boy in a Letterman jacket showed up in pictures spanning 5 years, always carrying a single yellow carnation to the same spot near the air pump. They come every year on the anniversary of their death, the attendant explained. Same clothes, same flowers, same routine. They place their memorial, stand there for exactly 13 minutes, and then they fade away like morning mist. I thought he was playing some kind of elaborate prank until he showed me the security camera footage. On a small black and white monitor behind the counter, he played recordings from different nights over the past several years. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m. on each recording, and in every case, I watched the same impossible scene unfold. A figure would approach one of the gas pumps, clearly visible on camera, and place flowers in a specific location. But when the attendant would check the pumps the next morning, the flowers would be fresh and real, despite the fact that the person who placed them had been dead for years. The security cameras captured them, but they cast no shadows, and their feet never quite seemed to touch the ground. Why 3:17 a.m.? I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. That's when most of the accidents happen, he said. Something about that exact time, when the fog is thickest and visibility is worst. The victims know when they're going to die, and they come back to mark the spot, to make sure they're not forgotten. As if on cue, the lights in the station flickered, and I heard the soft sound of footsteps outside. Through the window, I could see a figure approaching pump number 2. A middle-aged man in a business suit, carrying an elaborate arrangement of red roses. The attendant barely looked up from his magazine. That's Robert Hutchins, he said matter-of-factly. Died here March 15th, 2019. Lost control in the fog, hit the guardrail, and flipped his car 3 times. Comes back every year right on schedule. I watched in fascination and horror as the man carefully placed the roses around the base of the gas pump, arranged them with obvious care, and then stood perfectly still for exactly 13 minutes. His lips were moving as if he was speaking, but no sound reached us inside the station. When the 13 minutes were up, he began to fade, becoming more and more translucent until he disappeared entirely. The flowers will still be there in the morning, the attendant said. Fresh as if they were just delivered from a florist, even though the nearest flower shop is 60 miles away in Hickory. I should have left immediately. Should have gotten back in my car and driven straight to Charlotte without looking back. But something compelled me to stay. To understand what was happening at this impossible place where the dead returned to mourn themselves. The attendant, whose name was Earl, seemed grateful for the company and continued sharing stories about his supernatural customers. "The worst part isn't the ghosts," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee that had probably been sitting on the warmer for hours. "The worst part is the living people who stop here and get influenced by what they see. Some folks become obsessed with the accidents, with the victims. They start researching the crashes, tracking down details about the people who died, even showing up at funerals of people they never met." He showed me another section of his photo album, this one containing pictures of living people who had become regular visitors to the station. Unlike the ghostly victims who appeared once a year, these people came frequently, sometimes weekly, always carrying flowers and wearing expressions of intense grief for strangers they had never known in life. "There's something about this place that amplifies sorrow," Earl explained. "It draws grief like a magnet, whether it belongs to you or not. People stop here for gas and leave carrying the emotional weight of every person who ever died on this stretch of road." As he spoke, I realized I was feeling it myself. A deep, inexplicable sadness that seemed to seep up from the asphalt beneath my feet. The flowers around the gas pumps suddenly looked less like memorials and more like warnings, marking a place where the boundary between life and death had been worn thin by repeated tragedy. At 4:15 a.m., I finally left the Conoco station, but the sadness followed me. For weeks afterward, I found myself thinking about the victims whose stories Earl had shared, researching their accidents online, even considering driving back to leave flowers of my own. It took months of conscious effort to break free from the station's emotional pull, to stop feeling responsible for the grief of strangers. I take Interstate 77 to Charlotte now, even though it adds an hour to my drive. Some places collect tragedy like others collect dust, and the Conoco station on Route 321 has been gathering the sorrow of the dead for decades. The flowers that appear there every morning aren't just memorials. They're proof that some wounds never heal, and some grief is so powerful it creates its own reality. The attendant Earl still works there, still documents the impossible visitors who come to mourn themselves, still warns travelers about the emotional weight of stopping at a place where death has made itself at home. But most people just see a convenient gas station in the middle of nowhere, never noticing the flowers, never understanding that they're refueling at the intersection of the living and the dead. My GPS has never led me to a place that doesn't exist on any map. But that's exactly what happened when I blindly followed its directions through the backwoods of West Virginia. The town I found at the end of those impossible turns had been waiting for a new resident, and according to the people trapped there, I was exactly what they needed. I was driving from Pittsburgh to Virginia Beach for a weekend getaway, taking what I thought would be a scenic route through rural West Virginia instead of the boring interstate highways. My phone's GPS had been working perfectly all day, guiding me through winding mountain roads and small Appalachian towns that looked like postcards from another era. But somewhere around 8 p.m., as darkness settled over the mountains, the GPS started giving me directions that didn't make sense. "Turn left on Hollow Creek Road," the mechanical voice instructed. But when I looked to my left, there was only forest. No road, no street sign, nothing but trees and undergrowth. I slowed down, thinking I had missed something, but the GPS insisted I make the turn. After driving for another mile without seeing any road that matched the name, I decided to trust the technology that had never failed me before. That was my first mistake. The road that appeared when I finally found Hollow Creek Road was barely more than a dirt track, unmarked and overgrown with vegetation that scraped against my car windows. But the GPS showed it clearly, indicating this was indeed the correct route to my destination. The road wound deeper into the mountains, becoming narrower and more treacherous with each mile, until I was driving in first gear to navigate the steep grades and sharp switchbacks. "Turn right on Blackberry Ridge Lane," the GPS announced. And again, I found myself looking for a road that didn't seem to exist. This pattern continued for the next hour. The GPS would call out street names for turns onto roads that were invisible until the exact moment I needed them, as if they were materializing just for my passage. The strangest part was that once I made each turn, I could see the road clearly in my rearview mirror. But when I looked ahead, the next road remained hidden until the GPS announced it. It was like driving through a maze that revealed itself one piece at a time. And I was beginning to realize I had no idea how to reverse my route and get back to civilization. Around 9:30 p.m., after following dozens of these impossible directions, my GPS finally announced, "You have arrived at your destination." But I definitely hadn't arrived at Virginia Beach. Instead, I found myself in what looked like a small town from the 1950s, complete with vintage storefronts, old-fashioned streetlights, and cars parked along Main Street that belonged in a museum. The town appeared to be called Millfield, according to a weathered sign at the town limits. But I had never heard of any place by that name in West Virginia. The strangest thing was how normal everything looked, despite being completely out of place and time. People walked along the sidewalks, stores had lights on, and there was even a diner with customers visible through the windows. I pulled into what looked like a gas station, hoping to get directions back to the interstate. But the attendant who came out to help me was wearing clothes that hadn't been fashionable for 70 years. When I asked him about getting back to the main highway, he looked confused and said there was no highway anywhere near Millfield. "Been living here all my life," he said, his accent carrying the distinctive mountain drawl of rural West Virginia. "Never heard of any interstate highway." "You sure you got the right place?" That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Every person I could see, the gas station attendant, the people walking on the sidewalks, the customers in the diner, all looked like they were from different time periods. The gas station attendant was dressed like someone from the 1940s. But a woman walking past wore clothing that looked distinctly 1960s. And a man getting out of a car was dressed in 1980s business attire. When I mentioned this observation to the attendant, he smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, you're very observant," he said. "Most new arrivals don't notice that right away. Yes, people arrive here from all different times, but once you're here, time doesn't work the same way. We're all just residents of Millfield now." The word arrivals sent a chill down my spine. I asked him what he meant, and he explained that Millfield existed in what he called the spaces between places. According to him, certain people got lost while traveling and ended up in Millfield, where they became permanent residents whether they wanted to or not. The thing about getting lost, he explained, is that sometimes you don't just lose your way. Sometimes you lose your place in the world entirely. Millfield is where those people end up, and once you're here, well, leaving requires someone else to take your place. I demanded to know how to get back to the real world, back to roads that existed on actual maps. But he just shook his head sadly. "I've been trying to leave since 1943, he said. "Came here during the war when my car broke down on a mountain road that doesn't exist anymore. I was supposed to report for duty in Norfolk, but I never made it. My family probably thinks I deserted. As I walked through downtown Millfield, I met other residents with similar stories. A woman named Helen had been driving to her wedding in 1962 when she took a wrong turn that led her here. A businessman named Frank had been traveling to a conference in Atlanta in 1987 and had been trapped in Millfield for over 30 years. Each person had a story of following GPS directions or road signs that led them to this impossible place. And each had discovered that leaving required finding someone else to take their place in the town's strange population. The most disturbing part was learning about the town's recruitment system. According to the residents, Millfield needed a steady supply of new people to maintain its existence. The town would reach out through various means, manipulating GPS systems, creating phantom road signs, even influencing people's decision-making to encourage them to take routes that would lead them to Millfield. The town chooses who it wants, Helen explained as we sat in the 1950s-style diner, surrounded by people from different decades, all eating food that tasted exactly right for their respective time periods. It looks for people who are already lost in some way, people who are between places in their lives. Travelers, people running from something, folks who are searching for something they can't name. I realized with growing horror that I fit that description perfectly. I had been feeling directionless lately, taking this solo trip to Virginia Beach because I needed to get away from a job I hated and a relationship that was falling apart. I was literally and figuratively lost when Millfield found me. The residents explained that the only way to leave was to convince someone else to take your place, to pass on the burden of being trapped in this temporal pocket. But the process was complicated and required the willing participation of the replacement. You couldn't just trick someone into staying. They had to choose to remain in Millfield, usually by becoming emotionally invested in the community or developing relationships with other residents. Some people, they told me, had been trying to leave for decades, but couldn't bring themselves to condemn someone else to their fate. Others had given up entirely and accepted Millfield as their new reality. A few had tried to escape by force, but the roads that led into town simply didn't exist when you tried to leave. The GPS would malfunction, signs would disappear, and you'd find yourself driving in circles until you returned to Main Street. I spent 3 days in Millfield, staying at a boarding house that looked like something from the 1940s, but had modern amenities that somehow worked despite the town's temporal confusion. During that time, I met dozens of residents, each with their own story of arriving in this place that existed between the cracks of reality. On my 4th morning, I woke up to find a new arrival. A young woman named Sarah, who had been driving from Ohio to North Carolina when her GPS led her to Millfield. She was confused, scared, and asking the same questions I had asked when I arrived. As I watched the other residents welcome her with the same mixture of sympathy and hope I had received, I understood the terrible choice I was facing. I could stay in Millfield forever, becoming another resident with a story about getting lost on a mountain road. Or I could find a way to leave, knowing that my departure would trap Sarah or someone like her in this temporal prison. The town needed its population to remain stable, and every departure required a replacement. In the end, I made a choice that I still question every day. I convinced myself that Sarah seemed to be adapting well to Millfield, that she was already forming friendships with other residents, that maybe she wouldn't mind staying in a place where time moved differently and the past coexisted with the present. I left Millfield on a Tuesday morning, following roads that appeared just long enough for me to escape before dissolving back into the forest. My GPS worked normally once I reached the interstate, guiding me to Virginia Beach as if nothing unusual had happened. But I know Sarah is still there, along with all the others who arrived before her and the ones who will come after. and sometimes when I'm driving alone on unfamiliar roads. My GPS suggests routes that don't exist on any map, and I have to resist the urge to follow them back to a town that exists in the spaces between places, where lost travelers become permanent residents and time itself gets confused. Millfield is still out there, still reaching out through GPS systems and road signs, still looking for people who are lost enough to accept directions to nowhere. The storm that hit Interstate 80 through Nebraska was the worst blizzard in 20 years. But the convoy of 18-wheelers that let me join their formation for safety had been driving through it for much longer than that. I didn't realize until it was too late that some storms never end, and some drivers never reach their destination. I had been pushing my luck trying to make it from Denver to Chicago in one shot when the Weather Service issued emergency warnings about the blizzard bearing down on the Great Plains. By the time I hit the Nebraska border, visibility was down to maybe 50 feet. And the wind was rocking my sedan so violently I could barely keep it between the lines. That's when I saw the convoy. 7 massive semi-trucks were moving in perfect formation through the whiteout, their running lights creating a constellation of red and amber in the swirling snow. The lead truck had his CB radio open on channel 19, and I could hear the drivers coordinating their movements with the kind of professional precision that comes from years of experience dealing with severe weather. "Breaker 19, we've got a 4-wheeler looking to join up," came a voice through my radio when I keyed up to ask if I could follow them. "Roger that, little car. Fall in behind Roadkill Rick and stay tight. We're going to punch through this storm together." I had never been so grateful to see other vehicles in my life. The convoy moved at a steady 45 mph, fast enough to maintain momentum, but slow enough to handle the treacherous conditions. The driver they called Roadkill Rick was directly ahead of me in a blue Kenworth, and I could see his massive trailer cutting through the snow like an icebreaker through frozen seas. For the first hour, everything felt normal. The drivers chattered on the radio about weather conditions, upcoming truck stops, and the usual complaints about dispatchers and delivery schedules. They warned each other about black ice, called out when they spotted stranded vehicles, and maintained the kind of professional camaraderie that keeps long-haul truckers sane during difficult runs. But as the storm continued and the hours passed, I started noticing inconsistencies in their conversations. One driver mentioned delivering electronics to a Circuit City in Omaha, but Circuit City had been out of business for over a decade. Another talked about fuel prices that were way too low for current market rates. When I asked about it on the radio, they seemed confused by my questions. "What do you mean Circuit City's out of business?" came the response from the driver who had mentioned it. "I just delivered there last month. Big electronics store right off I-480. You sure you got the right place, little car?" That's when I started paying closer attention to the trucks themselves. Despite the storm and poor visibility, I could make out details about the rigs I was following, and something was definitely wrong. The trucks looked old, not vintage or classic, but old in a way that suggested they had been on the road far longer than their apparent condition would indicate. Paint jobs that should have been faded were pristine. Chrome that should have been pitted by road salt gleamed like new. And the trailer designs belonged to companies I remembered from years ago. Around midnight, we passed a rest area that was completely dark except for a few emergency lights. Most of the convoy continued on, but one truck, a red Peterbilt driven by someone called Iron Mike, announced he was pulling off to check his load straps. "Catch up when you can, Iron Mike," said the lead driver. "We'll keep the channel open for you." But Iron Mike never caught up. I kept listening for his voice on the radio, but he never checked back in. When I asked the other drivers about him an hour later, they seemed confused about who I was talking about. Iron Mike? Said Roadkill Rick. Don't know any driver by that name, little car. You sure you heard that right? I was certain I had heard it right. But when I described the red Peterbilt that had pulled off at the rest area, none of the other drivers remembered seeing it. According to them, the convoy had consisted of 6 trucks all along, not 7. That's when the real horror began to sink in. As the night wore on, more trucks began disappearing from the convoy, and each time, the remaining drivers had no memory of the missing vehicles. A white freightliner hauling what looked like furniture vanished somewhere near Grand Island, and when I asked about it, the other drivers insisted the convoy had only been 5 trucks strong from the beginning. By 3 a.m., we were down to 3 trucks plus my car. But the remaining drivers continued to act as if this was the original size of the convoy. They talked on the radio with the same casual familiarity, referenced shared experiences, and coordinated their movements with complete confidence, despite the fact that half their group had mysteriously disappeared. The lead driver, who called himself Ghost Rider, a name that now seemed ominously appropriate, started sharing stories about runs he had made in decades past. He talked about delivering loads to businesses that had closed years ago, described truck stops that had been torn down, and mentioned highways that had been rerouted or rebuilt. Been running this route since 1987, he said over the radio. Know every mile of it like the back of my hand. This storm ain't nothing compared to the blizzard of '96. Lost 3 good drivers that night, but we kept on trucking. Always keep on trucking. That's when I understood what was happening. This wasn't a normal convoy of drivers helping each other through a storm. This was a ghost convoy, a group of truckers who had died in previous blizzards but continued to run their routes, picking up living drivers who needed help and gradually adding them to their eternal journey. The remaining trucks were becoming more translucent as the night went on, their running lights dimming until they were barely visible through the snow. But the voices on the radio remained strong, continuing to offer encouragement and guidance to keep me moving forward. Don't you worry, little car, said Roadkill Rick, even though I could barely see his trailer ahead of me now. We'll get you through this storm. Been helping drivers through bad weather for longer than you might think. Some storms never really end, you know. They just keep rolling across the plains, and we keep rolling with them. I realized with growing terror that the other drivers weren't disappearing. They were fading back into whatever supernatural state they normally existed in, leaving only their voices on the radio to guide lost travelers through storms that had been raging for decades. When dawn finally broke, I found myself alone on an empty stretch of Interstate 80, with no sign of the convoy that had guided me through the night. The storm had passed, the roads were clear, and my radio was silent, except for the normal chatter of living truckers starting their day. But when I stopped at the next truck stop for fuel and coffee, I overheard a conversation between 2 drivers about the previous night's storm. One of them mentioned seeing a strange convoy of old trucks moving through the worst of the weather. Trucks that looked like they belonged to a different era of trucking. Damnedest thing I ever saw, he said, shaking his head. 7 big rigs running in perfect formation through a whiteout. But when I tried to raise them on the radio, got nothing but static. Looked like they had a car with them too, some little sedan trying to keep up. 7 trucks. The driver had seen the complete convoy, all the trucks that had disappeared during the night, plus my car following behind, which meant that from the outside, I had been part of a ghost convoy, visible to other drivers but unable to communicate with the living world. I finished my coffee in silence and got back on the road. But I couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened if I had stayed with the convoy until the end. Would I have faded away like the trucks, becoming another voice on the radio helping lost drivers through eternal storms? Would I have joined Ghost Rider and Roadkill Rick in their endless journey across the Great Plains? I take southern routes through Texas now when I drive from Denver to Chicago. It's longer, and the weather can be just as unpredictable. But I've learned that some help comes with a price, and some storms never end. The Ghost Convoy is still out there, still helping drivers through Nebraska blizzards, still recruiting new members for their eternal run across highways that exist in the space between life and death. And sometimes, on clear winter nights when the wind howls across the plains, truck drivers report seeing running lights in their mirrors, a convoy that follows them for miles before vanishing into the darkness, leaving only the faint sound of voices on the radio offering help to anyone brave enough to join their endless journey through storms that never break. The mandatory weigh station on Interstate 5 near Coalinga, California, operates 24 hours a day, but the inspections they conduct after midnight have nothing to do with vehicle weight or safety regulations. I discovered this during what should have been a routine compliance check when I realized they weren't weighing my truck. They were weighing something much more personal. I've been a commercial driver for 12 years, hauling everything from produce to electronics up and down the West Coast. And I thought I knew every weigh station between Seattle and San Diego. The Coalinga station had always been straightforward. Pull in, get weighed, show your logbook, and get back on the road. But when I rolled in there at 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday night in October, something was fundamentally different about the operation. The inspector who flagged me over was wearing the standard California Highway Patrol uniform. But something about him seemed off. His movements were too precise, too mechanical, and his eyes had the flat, emotionless quality of someone going through motions they had performed thousands of times before. When he asked for my commercial license and logbook, his voice carried no inflection, no hint of the casual professionalism I was used to from DOT inspectors. "Step out of the vehicle and proceed to the inspection building," he said, pointing toward a concrete structure I had never noticed before despite passing through this weigh station dozens of times. Mandatory additional screening required. The building looked official enough. Government-issued furniture, fluorescent lighting, forms and clipboards stacked on metal desks. But there were details that didn't make sense. The posters on the walls advertised safety regulations that didn't exist. The computer terminals displayed information in formats I had never seen. And there was a strange humming sound coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Inside, I was directed to a window where a middle-aged woman in a DMV-style uniform asked me to complete a series of forms. But these weren't the usual commercial vehicle inspection documents. The questions were personal, invasive, and completely unrelated to trucking regulations. Describe the worst thing you've ever done to another person. List 3 secrets you've never told anyone. Rate your level of guilt about past actions on a scale of 1-10. When I asked what this had to do with a weigh station inspection, the woman looked at me with the same flat expression as the inspector outside. "All drivers are required to complete the psychological assessment before proceeding," she said. "Federal Regulation 49 CFR 382.407. Failure to comply results in immediate suspension of commercial driving privileges." I had never heard of that regulation, but the woman showed me an official-looking document that seemed to authorize the procedure. Figuring it was some new bureaucratic requirement I hadn't been informed about, I reluctantly filled out the forms, though I lied on most of the personal questions. Some things are nobody's business, especially not the government's. After completing the paperwork, I was directed to another room where a man in a white coat was waiting beside what looked like a modified truck scale. But instead of being designed to weigh vehicles, this scale had a platform just large enough for a person to stand on. surrounded by electronic equipment that hummed and buzzed with an intensity that made my teeth ache. "Step onto the platform," the man instructed, consulting a clipboard filled with my completed forms. "This is a standard guilt assessment procedure. The equipment measures psychological weight rather than physical mass." That should have been my cue to leave, to demand to speak to a supervisor, to call my dispatcher and report what was happening. But something about the building, about the people working there, made it difficult to think clearly or make decisions. It was like being in a dream where you know something is wrong, but can't quite focus enough to do anything about it. I stepped onto the platform, and immediately the equipment began registering readings on displays I couldn't understand. Numbers scrolled across screens, graphs fluctuated wildly, and the humming sound intensified until it felt like it was coming from inside my head. The man in the white coat made notes on his clipboard while studying my reactions with clinical detachment. "Interesting readings," he said after several minutes of this bizarre procedure. "Significant psychological weight detected. History of vehicular manslaughter, never reported to authorities. Guilt index measuring 7.4 on the Cramden scale. Recommended disposition, Category 3, remediation." My blood ran cold. He was referring to something that had happened 8 years ago, an accident I had never reported to anyone. I had been driving through a construction zone in Oregon when a homeless man had stumbled into the road. I hit him at 25 mph and he died on impact. But it had been dark, raining, and there were no witnesses. I had convinced myself it was an unavoidable accident, that reporting it would only ruin my career without bringing the man back to life. "How do you know about that?" I demanded. But the man simply made more notes on his clipboard. "All psychological weight is detected and measured," he replied matter-of-factly. "The equipment is quite sensitive. We also show readings for insurance fraud from 2019, tax evasion spanning multiple years, and an incident of domestic violence from your marriage. Quite a substantial load you've been carrying." He was right about all of it. Every secret, every covered-up mistake, every moment of moral weakness I had tried to forget was somehow being detected and quantified by their impossible machinery. The platform I was standing on wasn't just measuring guilt. It was exposing it, dragging it up from wherever I had buried it and putting it on display. "What happens now?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "Category 3 remediation requires permanent retention," he said, as if he was discussing a routine maintenance procedure. "Subjects with excessive psychological weight cannot be safely returned to active duty. You'll be processed into our long-term containment program." That's when I noticed the other drivers. Through a window in the back wall, I could see what looked like a dormitory filled with men and women in trucker clothing, all sitting on identical beds, all staring at nothing with the same empty expression I had seen on the inspector and the woman at the desk. They looked like they had been there for months or even years. "Those are drivers who failed the assessment," the man explained when he saw me looking. "Excessive psychological weight makes them dangerous on public roads. They remain here indefinitely, serving the community through various work programs until their guilt index decreases to acceptable levels." I realized with growing horror that this wasn't a way station at all. It was some kind of processing facility designed to identify and remove drivers who were carrying too much emotional baggage, too many secrets, too much unresolved guilt. The government had found a way to detect and measure the psychological weight that every person carries, and they were using it to decide who was fit to remain in society. The man gestured toward a door that led to the dormitory area. "Please proceed to intake processing," he said. "Your personal effects will be cataloged and stored. Family members will be notified of your indefinite detention pending psychological remediation. But something about the clinical nature of the whole operation, the casual way they discussed ruining people's lives, sparked an anger that cut through the mental fog I had been experiencing. I wasn't going to become another empty-eyed resident of their impossible prison. I shoved past the man in the white coat and ran for the exit, ignoring his shouts about federal violations and mandatory compliance. The building seemed larger than it had when I entered, with corridors that led to rooms I hadn't seen before. But I kept running until I found the main entrance. Outside, my truck was still sitting on the regular vehicle scale, but there were no other inspectors around. The parking area was empty, except for my Peterbilt, and when I looked back at the building I had just escaped from, it appeared to be nothing more than a small office with normal way station equipment. I got in my truck and drove straight through to Sacramento without stopping. But for weeks afterward, I was paranoid about every way station, every DUT inspection, every official contact. I started researching the facility at Coalinga, but found no records of psychological assessment programs or any of the procedures I had experienced. But I also started noticing things I had missed before. Drivers who disappeared from regular routes without explanation, way stations with unusual equipment, reports of inspections that lasted hours longer than they should have. The trucking industry has always had stories about drivers who vanished without a trace, and I began to wonder how many of them had been processed through facilities like the one I had escaped from. I drive different routes now, avoiding certain way stations, especially the one near Coalinga, because somewhere in California, and probably in other states, the government is weighing more than just trucks. They're weighing souls, measuring guilt, and deciding who carries too much psychological weight to remain free. And the scariest part is that their equipment works perfectly. Every secret they detected, every hidden crime they measured, was completely accurate. Which means they have the ability to expose anyone's darkest moments and use them as justification for permanent detention. The way stations are still operating, still measuring loads that have nothing to do with cargo, still processing drivers who fail assessments they never knew they were taking. Route 287 between Amarillo and Dallas has exactly 347 mile markers. But mile marker 13 only appears when someone is about to die. I discovered this during my evening commute from Fort Worth, when a marker that had never existed before materialized in my headlights like a tombstone rising from the asphalt. I had driven that same stretch of Texas highway every weekday for 3 years, working as a pharmaceutical sales rep covering the north-central region of the state. I knew every landmark, every exit, every mile marker between my apartment in Fort Worth and the various medical offices I visited throughout the area. Route 287 was as familiar to me as the hallway in my own home, which is why I immediately noticed when something appeared that had never been there before. It was a Thursday evening in November, and I was driving home from a late appointment in Wichita Falls when I saw mile marker 13 standing beside the southbound lane like it had always been there. But I knew with absolute certainty that there was no mile marker 13 on this section of highway. The markers in this area jumped from 12 to 14, something I had noticed years ago and attributed to a surveying error or construction quirk. The marker looked exactly like all the others. Standard green metal sign with white reflective numbers, mounted on a steel post at the regulation height. But something about it seemed wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. The numbers looked too bright, too perfect, as if they had been installed moments before. And there was a strange quality to the light reflecting off the sign that made it seem to glow independently of my headlights. Over the next few days, I found myself watching for mile marker 13 during my daily commutes, but it was never there. The highway returned to its normal configuration, with markers jumping from 12 to 14, just as they always had. I began to think I had been more tired than I realized that Thursday night, that my mind had played a trick on me in the darkness. But the following Tuesday, mile marker 13 appeared again, this time during my morning drive north toward Decatur. Same position, same impossible perfection, same eerie quality to the reflective numbers. And this time, I pulled over to examine it more closely. Standing beside the marker, I could see that it was completely real. Solid metal and concrete, properly installed with regulation hardware. But when I looked at the ground around its base, there were no signs of recent construction, no disturbed soil, no evidence that anyone had been there to install it. The marker simply existed, as if it had materialized from nothing. That afternoon, I learned about the accident. A colleague mentioned that Dr. Richard Morrison, one of the physicians I regularly visited, had been killed in a single-car rollover on Route 287 that morning. The accident had occurred at approximately 7:30 a.m., right around the time I'd seen mile marker 13 during my northbound drive. When I researched the exact location of Dr. Morrison's accident, I discovered it had happened at the precise spot where I had seen the mysterious mile marker. The highway patrol report indicated that he had lost control of his vehicle for unknown reasons, veered off the road, and died instantly when his car rolled multiple times. This could have been a coincidence, but something about the timing bothered me. I started researching the history of accidents along Route 287, particularly fatalities that had occurred in the area where mile marker 13 had appeared. What I found was disturbing enough to make me question everything I thought I knew about coincidence and probability. Over the past 10 years, there had been 17 fatal accidents along that specific stretch of highway, and in every case, multiple witnesses had reported seeing a mile marker 13 either shortly before or shortly after the incident. Some saw it on their way to work on the morning of an accident. Others noticed it during evening commutes on days when someone died during daylight hours. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Mile marker 13 appeared as a warning or announcement of impending death, manifesting itself to drivers who traveled the route regularly enough to notice its impossible presence. But it wasn't just appearing randomly. According to the accident reports, it only showed itself to people who had some connection to the victims. Dr. Morrison had been my client for 2 years. I had appointments with him every month, knew his staff, had even met his wife at a medical conference. We weren't friends, but we had a professional relationship that went beyond mere business. And mile marker 13 had appeared to me on the morning he died, in the exact location where his life would end. I began keeping a detailed log of every time I saw the marker, noting the date, time, weather conditions, and my emotional state. Over the next 6 months, mile marker 13 appeared 7 more times, and each appearance was followed within 24 hours by news of a fatal accident involving someone I knew, however peripherally. A nurse from one of the clinics I serviced died in a head-on collision 12 hours after I saw the marker on a foggy March morning. A pharmacist I'd worked with for years suffered a fatal heart attack while driving home from work, and I had seen mile marker 13 that same afternoon. Each death occurred at the exact location where the marker had appeared, and each victim was someone whose loss affected me personally. The most disturbing incident happened on a bright June morning when mile marker 13 appeared more vividly than ever before, its numbers seeming to pulse with their own internal light. I pulled over immediately and called my dispatcher to ask if any of my clients had canceled appointments or reported emergencies. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone I knew was in immediate danger. That evening, I learned that my ex-wife, Jennifer, had been killed in a motorcycle accident that afternoon. We had divorced 2 years earlier, but remained on friendly terms. And she had been riding her new Harley to a job interview in Dallas when she lost control on a curve and collided with a guardrail. The accident had occurred at mile marker 13's location, and the time of death was estimated to be just 3 hours after I had seen the sign. The realization that mile marker 13 was predicting deaths and that I was somehow connected to its appearance was almost too much to handle. I started avoiding Route 287 entirely, taking longer alternate routes that added an hour to my daily commute. But even when I stayed off that highway, I would find myself checking traffic reports and accident databases, waiting for news of fatalities that might be connected to my absence. After 3 weeks of avoiding the route, I returned to Route 287 for a critical client meeting that couldn't be rescheduled. I drove the entire stretch twice that day without seeing mile marker 13, and began to hope that whatever force was responsible for its appearances had moved on to torment someone else. But mile marker 13 appeared one final time on a humid August evening when I was driving home from what I had decided would be my last business trip on Route 287. The marker looked different this time. Older, more weathered, as if it had been standing there for decades rather than materializing from nothing. And the numbers 13 seemed to be pointing directly at me rather than simply marking distance. I understood immediately what was happening. Mile marker 13 wasn't just predicting deaths. It was selecting them. Each person whose fatal accident had occurred at that location had been chosen by whatever supernatural force controlled the marker's appearances. The connections we shared, the relationships that linked us to the highway and to each other, were what determined who would die and when. And now it was my turn. I drove home that night knowing with absolute certainty that my time was running out. That mile marker 13 had marked me for death just as it had marked all the others. The only question was when and how the accident would occur. 3 days later, I was driving to my office on a clear Tuesday morning when my tire blew out at exactly the spot where mile marker 13 had appeared so many times before. My car veered off the highway, rolled twice, and came to rest against the same guardrail that had killed Jennifer 3 months earlier. But I survived. Somehow, despite the severity of the accident. I walked away with nothing more than bruises and a concussion. The highway patrol officer who responded to the scene said it was the most miraculous survival he had ever witnessed. That by all rights, the accident should have been fatal. I never saw mile marker 13 again after that day. It had appeared to me for the last time, and when I failed to die as predicted, it apparently moved on to find someone else to torment with its impossible knowledge of impending death. But sometimes, when I'm driving through Texas on business trips, I hear from other salespeople about a mysterious mile marker 13 that appears on different highways throughout the state. Always in locations where people are about to die, always visible only to those who have some connection to the victims. The marker is still out there, still selecting people for death, still appearing as both warning and prophecy to drivers who travel the same roads often enough to notice when something impossible becomes real. And somewhere in Texas, someone else is seeing mile marker 13 for the first time, not yet understanding that they're looking at their own obituary written in reflective numbers beside a lonely stretch of highway. Exit 127 on Interstate 84 through Eastern Oregon appears on every GPS and highway map, but it doesn't lead where the signs promise it will. I discovered this during my third attempt to take that exit, when I finally understood that some destinations exist solely to collect travelers who are too curious for their own good. I work as a night shift supervisor at a logistics company in Portland. which means I spend a lot of time driving between warehouses and distribution centers throughout the Pacific Northwest. Interstate 84 is my primary route when I need to reach facilities in Eastern Oregon, and I've driven that highway hundreds of times over the past 5 years. So when I started noticing exit 127 appearing in places where it had never been before, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. The first time I saw the exit, I was driving east toward Pendleton around 2 a.m. on a Wednesday night in September. I had made this exact drive dozens of times before, and I was certain there was no exit 127 between the Boardman and Arlington exits. But there it was, clearly marked with standard highway signage that read, Exit 127, Last Chance Rest Area, 1 mile. I was running ahead of schedule and curious about this rest area I had never noticed, so I decided to investigate. But as I approached the exit ramp, my cell phone lost signal completely. My GPS screen went black, and my radio filled with static. Something about the electronics failing simultaneously made me nervous enough to continue past the exit without taking it. The next morning, I researched exit 127 extensively, checking highway department records, satellite maps, and trucking forums where drivers share information about rest stops and facilities. According to every official source, there was no exit 127 on that section of Interstate 84. The exits jumped from 126 to 128, just as I had always remembered. But exit 127 appeared again 2 weeks later, this time during my return trip to Portland. Same signage, same promise of a rest area, same electronic failures as I approached the off-ramp. This time I was more prepared, so I slowed down and tried to see what lay beyond the exit ramp. Through the darkness, I could make out what looked like a large parking area with several buildings, all illuminated by the kind of harsh fluorescent lighting used at highway rest stops. I decided to take the exit on my third encounter with it, which happened during a daylight drive in October. If this was some kind of hallucination or technical glitch, I wanted to understand what was happening while I could see clearly. The exit ramp looked completely normal and well-maintained, leading to a sprawling rest area that was significantly larger than typical highway facilities. The parking lot contained dozens of vehicles, cars, trucks, RVs, motorcycles, all arranged in neat rows as if their owners had parked them with care and intention. But something was wrong with the scene. The vehicles represented different eras of automotive design, from 1960s muscle cars to modern electric vehicles, and many of them showed signs of having been parked for extended periods. Dust, bird droppings, flat tires, and other indicators of long-term abandonment were visible on vehicles throughout the lot. The rest area buildings were more elaborate than anything I had seen on other highways. Instead of simple concrete structures with basic restrooms and vending machines, this complex included what looked like a visitor center, a restaurant, a convenience store, and even a small motel. All of the buildings were well-maintained and brightly lit, but eerily quiet despite the number of vehicles in the parking lot. I parked near the visitor center and walked toward the main building, passing other travelers who were moving through the area with the slow, purposeful gait of people who had nowhere urgent to be. They nodded politely as I passed, but their eyes had a distant quality that reminded me of patients in a hospital waiting room who had been there far too long. Inside the visitor center, I found displays about local attractions, historical information about the area, and brochures for tourist destinations throughout Eastern Oregon. But the information was inconsistent and confusing. Some brochures advertised attractions that had been closed for years, others promoted events that had happened decades ago, and a few described places that didn't exist anywhere in Oregon. The woman behind the information desk looked to be in her 40s, dressed in the kind of uniform you'd expect from a government employee, but her behavior was unsettling. She smiled constantly with the fixed expression of someone who had been trained to be helpful, but had lost track of what helpfulness actually meant. "Welcome to the Last Chance Rest Area," she said in a voice that was too cheerful for the late hour. "Are you planning to stay with us for a while, or will you be continuing your journey?" I told her I was just stopping briefly to stretch my legs and get some coffee. But her smile never wavered as she slid a clipboard across the counter toward me. "All visitors need to complete the registration form," she explained. "Just standard information, name, destination, estimated length of stay. Some people find they want to extend their visit once they see what we have to offer." The form asked for basic travel information, but some of the questions were oddly specific. "Are you traveling alone? Do people know your exact route and schedule? How long before someone would notice if you didn't arrive at your destination?" The questions felt less like customer service inquiries and more like an assessment of how missed I would be if I disappeared. I declined to fill out the form and asked about getting back to Interstate 84, but the woman's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, you don't want to leave so soon," she said. "Most people find our rest area very restful. Many of our guests decide to stay much longer than they originally planned." That's when I noticed the other travelers in the visitor center weren't actually doing anything. They were sitting in chairs reading the same brochures over and over, staring at displays they had clearly seen multiple times, or simply standing in place with that same distant expression I had observed in the parking lot. They looked like people who had been waiting for something for a very long time, but had forgotten what they were waiting for. I excused myself and walked quickly back to my car. But as I tried to leave the rest area, I discovered that the exit back to the interstate wasn't where I expected it to be. The road I had taken to enter the facility seemed to have vanished, replaced by a circular drive that led only to different sections of the rest area complex. I drove around the perimeter of the facility for 20 minutes, searching for the exit ramp back to Interstate 84. But every road led deeper into the rest area or to parking areas for different types of vehicles. There were sections for cars, trucks, RVs, and motorcycles, all filled with vehicles that showed varying degrees of abandonment. Finally, I parked again and approached a man who was washing his car with the methodical attention of someone performing a familiar routine. When I asked him about leaving the rest area, he looked at me with confusion. "Leave?" he said, as if the concept was foreign to him. "Why would you want to leave? This is a very nice place, very peaceful. I've been here." He paused, apparently trying to remember. "Well, I'm not sure how long I've been here, but it feels like the right amount of time." I asked him what he did at the rest area, how he spent his days, what he was waiting for. His answers were vague and circular, describing activities that sounded meaningful but accomplished nothing. He washed his car regularly, read brochures about places he never visited, ate meals at the restaurant that never made him feel full, and slept in the motel rooms that never provided real rest. "The important thing," he said, returning to his methodical car washing, "is that there's no pressure here. No schedules, no deadlines, no need to be anywhere else. You can just exist." The horror of what was happening finally became clear. The Last Chance Rest Area was exactly what its name suggested. A final stop for travelers who were running away from something, looking for something, or simply lost enough to accept any destination that promised rest. Once you stayed long enough to complete their registration process, to accept their hospitality, to let your guard down completely, you became part of the facility's permanent collection of displaced travelers. I ran back to my car and started driving in increasingly desperate circles around the rest area. honking my horn and flashing my lights, refusing to accept that there was no exit. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I spotted a gap in the landscaping that might have been a service road. I drove through it at dangerous speed, bouncing over rough terrain until I finally saw the blessed sight of Interstate 84 ahead. I merged back onto the highway without looking back, and I've never seen exit 127 again. But I've researched it extensively since that night, and I've found references to similar rest areas throughout the American highway system, facilities that appear on some maps but not others. Exits that lead to destinations designed to keep travelers permanently. The Last Chance Rest Area is still out there, still collecting people who are lost enough to accept any invitation to rest, still promising relief from the pressures of travel and life and responsibility. And somewhere in eastern Oregon, dozens of vehicles sit in neat rows while their owners wash them with endless patience, read the same brochures repeatedly, and wait for something they can no longer remember. Call to action. These 11 stories represent just a fraction of the disturbing encounters that happen on America's highways every single night. If you or someone you know has experienced something similar, unexplained phenomena on the road, encounters with people who shouldn't exist, or destinations that don't appear on any map, we want to hear from you. The Verified Fears community is built on sharing authentic experiences that remind us how mysterious and dangerous our world can be. Your story could be the next one that keeps people awake at night, wondering what's really waiting for them on those dark stretches of highway. Don't forget to subscribe to Verified Fears. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the unexplained. Share these stories with anyone who travels frequently. They deserve to know what's out there. And remember, the road less traveled is often less traveled for a very good reason.